Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about food safety and pesticides. There's some key learning objectives that we want to make sure that you understand. So we want you to know about vectors and disease. That's going to be super important. How climate change is affecting plant growth and how that's influencing vector-borne disease. So we'll want you to make some predictions there. And then how some of these disasters that we're going to be able to see now and in the future might affect food safety. There are government agencies that oversee all of this. So how might that work, especially when you start to put in disasters and some of these other conditions? And then also there are a lot of different pathogens. So pick a few and kind of look into how they can wreak havoc on our bodies. You don't necessarily need to know the details, but just to get a general sense of some of those things. So you've seen this before about how different aspects of planetary health can impact human health. So for example, all of these things are going to have an impact on the way that we interact with our environment. One of the examples might be the hardiness zones of plants. So this is the USDA plant hardiness zone map from 1990 and 2006. And you can see that the cold regions are going farther north, for example, and we're going to see differences in where we're getting precipitation and lots of other things. So you can imagine that there might be some differences in the where certain animals and insects are going to be living and where they might be moving. You can also imagine that the plants, so the durations of pollen, are going to change, and that might impact people's asthma, for example. So as all of these things are happening, make predictions about what you might expect to see. When you're thinking about direct climate change effects on vectors, so you can think about it in a couple of different ways. So it might be temperature, the heat and the cold. It might be wind patterns, spreading seeds. It could be because there's just less water available, for example, or changes in humidity. So there's lots of different ways that, it might impact vectors. So these are just a few. So we're not going to go too deeply into vectors necessarily as part of these slides. However, make sure you're familiar with them. Make sure you understand how they work, and that as you have these vectors which transmit either viruses or all sorts of other things from one species potentially to another. That's the general gist. So as we're thinking about how climate change might affect our health, keep in mind that we're expecting to see a lot more increases in vector-borne disease. So that might be through mosquitoes, like through malaria or Zika, for example. It could be through ticks. So for example, Lyme disease has doubled from 1991 to 2013. So think about how the different vectors may expand their geographical range, how they might change their behaviors, and how humans might be in the middle of all of that. So we're going to be expecting to see some additional diseases related to this. If you haven't seen this marketing approach through the CDC. So they put this out a while ago, but I love it because it shows how difficult it is to necessarily see some of these vectors. So there are 5 ticks in the photo, but they can be really challenging to see, especially when they blend in so well. To orient you, in case you need any practice in going through some of these things. So there's a Quizlet that talks about different pesticides and toxicants and matching those, because as we have more vector-borne disease, people sometimes use pesticides in order to kill them. However, some of those pesticides have consequences for human health, so you can get a sense of those. And also for vectors, what are the different vectors that we're talking about, and what are the different diseases that they may transmit? So there are 2 Quizlets for each of those. Neither of them are graded by any stretch, but gives you a sense to play around. So one of the things that I want you to think about as we go through are how are natural disasters going to impact food systems? So this slide is showing you about Hurricane Florence. That was in 2018. It impacted the East Coast pretty substantially, and the pictures here are for North Carolina. So the top left panel, you see the amount of rain that came to these regions. So where you have this dark purple, down to the bottom right-hand corner, Wilmington had up to 30 to 50 inches of rain, and above that, you're at 15 to 20, give or take. So as you think about that, and then you overlay, the concentrated animal feeding operations that are in those regions. So In yellow, it shows the poultry operations. In pink shows the swine operations, so pigs, for example. You can see that especially the regions that were swine operations, they were dramatically hit by Hurricane Florence. So one of the things that happened was related to the flooding of these areas. So just to orient you, so down through here is Wilmington. Also up through here is Wilmington, and this area right up in this area, in just north and north and west of Wilmington, those areas got flooded pretty substantially. And the reason that this matters is that not only did it influence the animals that were being grown there, raised there, but a lot of the byproducts that were in those regions. So, for example, not only were the fecal waste from these animals pushed into these waterways, but also there are a lot of coal burning power plants that are in these general regions, and a lot of those those floodwaters pushed a lot of those sediments, which contain toxic byproducts, into our waterways. So as we're kind of looking at this overlay between natural disasters and our food systems, like, you're going to be able to start making some predictions about what you might expect based on what we know about some of these heavy metals in our food supply, or based on the increased amount of fertilizers or animal waste into our water system. So as we're going through some of these things, we realize that hurricanes can lead to water level rise and flooding. But how might these overflowing coal ash pits or the CAFO, the cesspits from the manure, influence our health? And how might food safety be influenced? So think about these things. This is just an example. You can imagine that many other disasters are going to have similar but different impacts. And it's not just disasters. So, for example, sometimes we have government shutdowns. And when we lack the inspectors, how might our food safety be influenced? Or when we have pandemics like COVID-19 that are influencing how food inspectors are able to access some of these facilities, how might our food systems and our food safety be impacted? These are things that we want you to consider. So in terms of who oversees this, there are generally three main bodies: USDA, FDA, and the EPA. So we're going to go into a lot of those general details of kind of who regulates what, but knowing who regulates things and why is generally important. So as we're going through, the EPA is generally going to look at some of these pesticides and biopesticides. The FDA is going to look at food and feed, and the USDA is going to be looking at like the production of plants, and also kind of how the systems, so when I say systems, like how are animals raised and in what facilities. But it gets complicated. So if you're looking at comparing between USDA and FDA, for example, if you're looking at eggs, the USDA is regulating the facilities, but the FDA is regulating the feed that's going to the hens and also the eggs themselves. And if you're talking about pepperoni or pizza toppings, pepperoni is through USDA, cheese is through FDA, and then even within sausage just itself, USDA versus the sausage meat, whereas the casings are regulated through FDA. So it gets complicated. So there's a Quizlet to help you. It will take you through those general rules and regulations for those three, and also the local health departments. The key thing that we want you to know related to food safety is that there is a danger zone, and this is where bacteria grow substantially during that period of time. So you want to keep food hot, and then if you need to cool it, you want to cool it fast and get it down to temperature so bacteria can't grow. So foodborne illness makes up a ton of disease for us. So that includes things like bacteria, things like parasites, viruses, and all sorts of different types of toxins. So lots of people get sick each year, lots of people die, and it costs a ton of money to our systems. The other thing that you should keep in mind related to food safety are these harmful algal blooms. And this is not only dangerous for you, but also for your pets. So you might have heard of red tide. So these are when the nutrients are just right and the algae can grow in dramatic numbers, and they can produce toxic byproducts that can make us and our pets sick, for example. So we try to avoid eating shellfish during this time, for example. There's a beautiful ArcGIS map that talks about harmful algal blooms in Oregon and kind of where they're located and what they mean. But if our pets, like for example, our dogs, we go to a pond or a lake together and they go swimming and they drink the water, pets can get sick and die. So this is something to keep in mind. It is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of, especially as we have a lot of fertilizer that's being released into our waterways. Also, it's not just, a single foodborne infection that's going to make you sick. So there's new data that's coming through that's showing that even these sub-threshold doses of these bacteria can really prime our immune systems to have an over-response related to inflammatory cascades. And this might influence like irritable bowel syndrome, ulcerative colitis. So as we are exposed to these bacteria, simply being exposed again can cause more damage than the first time. As for resources, I have two favorite ones. The first one is, no question, is the FDA foodborne illness. I keep this on my fridge. I love it. And also, if you want something with more detail, the Bad Bug book is pretty awesome. It's super detailed. It's probably more detail than you'd ever need. However, if you are curious about how something works or how to kill it, that's the place to go. So we showed this slide once before, where as we have the food that's coming to us, we may eat it. It may or may not be infected if we haven't cooked it properly, and it can cause a lot of problems. So cysticercosis is through pigs. It can produce problems for humans because it can infect brains, and so that can cause some serious problems. And so a researcher named Seth O'Neill at the OHSU PSU School of Public Health studies this, and it's a pretty amazing parasite. So something to keep in mind, just as an example. Also, as we're working in our food systems, for example, we realize that animals carry bacteria in their guts. So many are trying to give them antibiotics to kill that. However, the downside is that giving these animals antibiotics can also increase the spread of antibacterial resistant bacteria, antibiotic resistant bacteria, pardon me. And so that can cause some additional problems because then people can get sick with infections from antibiotic resistant bacteria. So this is something that we are going to be concerned of down the road. In terms of the bright side, because it's not necessarily all downside. So one of the great things is that we've learned a lot. So as opposed to fertilizer, understanding companion planting is an amazing way for supporting agriculture. So plants love their nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Each has a different function. And you can use manure. You can use all sorts of other components to stimulate your soil and measure the NPK composition for enhancing the growth of your plants. The other way that they will show it often is companion planting. So some plants do really, really well at being planted together. And that it not only helps with the nutrients that are being produced or the nutrients that the plants need in order to thrive, but often they will repel insects in certain ways. So you'll often hear like marigolds, for example, they have pyrethrins in them that are really effective for repelling insects. So they're often planted with other plants, for example. And one of the classic, and this is our last slide, is the three sisters. So this is corn, squash, and beans. And so together they have these complete amino acid profiles that are not only helpful for nutrients in human health, but also as they're being rotated, it prevents the soil from becoming depleted and or as susceptible to insects or disease. So, and the other thing that's wonderful is like corn grows really tall. And so, the beans and squash are able to like weave through the corn. So things to keep in mind. This has been done for many years and is a wonderful strategy. So lots of opportunity. Food safety is super important, and keep those things in mind as you go down the systems.